Sir, Congress having been pleased by the resolution of the 5th instant to authorize me to appoint an officer to the command of the Southern Army, you will therefore proceed without delay to North Carolina and take the command accordingly. I can give you no particular instructions, but must leave you to govern yourself entirely according to your own prudence and judgment in the circumstances in which you find yourself.
Letter from George Washington to Major General Nathanael Greene, 22 October, 1780. Greene fully understood the difficulties facing the Southern Army in bringing together a cohesive fighting force to stand against the well-trained troops of Cornwallis. When General Greene took over the command of the Southern troops, he arrived in Charlotte to an army of only 800 men. Greene knew his advantage then would not be in the number of troops, but his knowledge of the terrain, tactical movements, and the interests of the people of South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. It was with this knowledge that Greene came to the decision to divide his army. As an intact unit, it would be exceptionally difficult to procure the needed supplies of rations to feed his men and horses, but by sending out Colonel Daniel Morgan and his troops west toward the Catawba River, he knew they'd have a better chance of supplying the army, protecting the patriot citizens who lived in the area, and indirectly harassing the army of Cornwallis.
The object of this detachment is to give protection to that part of the country and spirit up the people, to annoy the enemy in that quarter, to collect the provisions and forage out of their way. You will prevent plundering as much as possible and be as careful of your provisions and forage.
Letter Nathanael Greene to Daniel Morgan, 16 December, 1780. Cornwallis had been trailing the struggling American army since Camden, but his supply lines were located along the southern coast. The hostility of the Patriots along this route prevented Cornwallis from moving additional supplies inland. Cornwallis was then dependent upon ravaging the land and the families along the way, which destroyed any possible good relations between the British and the locals. In January 1781, Cornwallis felt Morgan was becoming a threat to his left flank, so he sent Lieutenant Colonel Bonarste Tarleton to defeat him. Tarleton had under his control 1,100 British regulars, and he felt he had cornered Morgan against the Broad River at a location called the Cowpens. Morgan, however, had set his men on a defensive position on 3 hills, and when Tarleton ordered a frontal attack, Morgan's men captured, killed, or wounded all but 160 of Tarleton's men.
Dear Sir, the troops I had the honor to command have been so fortunate as to obtain a complete victory over a detachment from the British Army commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Tarleton.
Letter from Daniel Morgan to General Greene, 19 January, 1781. As soon as Greene received news about the Cowpens' victory, he decided to unite his forces. Greene instructed Morgan to requisition all the horses and wagons he needed for his withdrawal. While Morgan began his march toward Salisbury, Cornwallis was forced to wait 2 days for the Catawba River to lower after being swollen by the melting snow and rain. Although Morgan now had a 30-mile lead, Cornwallis was sure he could trap him on the banks of the Yadkin River. Thankfully, due to Greene's knowledge of the river system in North Carolina and his strategic preparedness, an armada of boats was ready to move Morgan's troops across the Yadkin. Greene knew his troops did not have the number or experience to face the British at this time, so he proceeded to march his men toward the Dan River, where he planned to cross and wait in Virginia for additional men and supplies to arrive at his camp. Cornwallis was positive that Greene would be unable to cross the Dan into Virginia, so after traveling a little further north and fording the Yadkin River with his troops, he proceeded to follow Greene to the Dan. By the time Cornwallis arrived, Greene had already moved his men across the river, so Cornwallis, with his supplies running low, decided to move his troops towards Hillsborough, where he felt he could muster support of Loyalists. Unfortunately for Cornwallis, the reports he had heard of high Loyalist support in North Carolina were overstated, and food and supplies for his men remained scarce. Meanwhile, Greene waited patiently in Virginia for additional men to come into camp, and on February 8th, he began sending small units of his army back across the Dan into North Carolina to harass the British and disrupt their foraging ability. One of these first groups was a cavalry unit led by Light Horse Harry Lee, who successfully tempered any loyalist support Cornwallis might have mustered by pretending to be a member of Tarleton's cavalry and killing a large group of Tories riding to join Cornwallis. The encounter was labeled Pyle's Massacre. Finally, on February 24th, with his army of Continentals and militia, Greene recrossed the Dan into North Carolina. Although on paper Greene's army numbered around 4,400, many of those men had never seen battle before. On March 14th, Greene moved his men from the Speedwell Ironworks toward Guilford Courthouse. This was an area Greene had been through before and recognized the tactical advantage of the land. There was a series of 3 rising hills to station his men in lines similar to those Morgan had used at Cowpens, heavy forest to break up the advancement of the British lines and provide cover for the untested troops, and the Courthouse Road at the back of the lines to allow for a retreat if needed. But the major question for Greene was how the untested militia and new Continental recruits would perform under pressure.
If they fight, you will beat Cornwallis. If not, he will beat you, and perhaps cut your regulars to pieces, which will be losing all our hopes.
Daniel Morgan, letter to Nathaniel Greene, 20 February, 1781. Greene divided his army into 3 lines. The first consisted of 1,000 untested North Carolina militia stationed at the center of the line with rifles poised on wooden fences. They were anchored on either side by riflemen and Continentals led by Washington and Lee. As Morgan had done at Cowpens, Greene asked these men to fire twice and then fall back. The second line consisted of Virginia militia who were looking to redeem themselves after their disastrous performance at Camden, and the third line was composed of Greene's Continentals. However, only the 1st Maryland Regiment was made up of battle-tested troops. The British began the assault on the first line of North Carolina militia around mid-morning. These British soldiers had been subsisting on poor rations and little rest since Cornwallis burned their supply wagons to rapidly chase Greene in the race to the Dan. At this point, Cornwallis had divested the land around him of any forageable material and needed a victory at Guilford to resurrect his army's morale. They were more than 200 miles from the coast at Wilmington, North Carolina, their nearest supply location, and the harassment of the British supply lines by the local rebels made shipment of supplies by river or land impossible. When Cornwallis arrived at Guilford, he was unsure about the Americans' location due to the thick woods, and although he passed through the area earlier, he didn't take note of the terrain. The local citizens were also of no help to him and didn't reveal any information about the land or Patriot troop locations.
The woods on our right and left were reported to be impracticable for cannon, but as that on our right appeared the most open, I resolved to attack the left wing of the enemy.
Lord Cornwallis Battle Report, Guilford Courthouse. As the British line approached the position of the North Carolina militia, they saw a daunting sight. According to Sergeant Roger Lamb of the Royal Fusiliers, the militia had their arms presented and resting on a rail fence, and they were taking aim with the nicest precision. As the British marched forward, the Americans began to fire, and according to some of the eyewitnesses, 1/2 of the Highlanders dropped on the spot. As the British reformed their lines and advanced with their bayonets, the North Carolina militia broke and the men scattered toward the woods. Fighting on the flanks of the American line remained intense, but slowly Washington's cavalry was pushed back to the second line of Virginia, and Lee's men moved further into the forest away from the main American line, pursued closely by the British. In the center of the second line were stationed the Virginians, with sharpshooters behind them to prevent men from running. The soldiers fought in thick woods, and it was difficult for either side to ascertain the progress of the battle. The battle at the second line finally turned in favor of the British when General Cornwallis left the road to lead a charge. The American right flank of Lynch and Washington moved backwards to the third line and joined the Continentals there. When Webster pushed through the woods after the Virginians, he couldn't see the third line of the American Continentals standing at the top of the hill in the shadow of the trees. So he pushed his beleaguered soldiers forward in a full charge. As the British reached the slope, the 1st Maryland was waiting for them and unleashed deadly musket fire, which caused heavy casualties. After being hit in the knee, Webster ordered a withdrawal back to the ravine to wait for additional reinforcements. Further down the American line, additional British soldiers led a charge against the untested 2nd Maryland with devastating results. The entire 2nd Maryland line broke before the British onslaught, and the men ran into the woods. Stuart's men rushed after the fleeing 2nd Maryland until William Washington arrived with his cavalry and the 1st Maryland. Riding with Washington was Peter Franco, who supposedly killed 11 men on that field with his sword before he himself was wounded. Washington and the 1st Maryland began pushing the British troops back to the 2nd line, but Cornwallis ordered that grapeshot be placed in his 3-pounders and the guns be aimed at the mass of troops, both British and American. When the grapeshot was unleashed, many men on both sides fell to the ground dead or wounded, but the cannon fire did what Cornwallis had hoped. It stopped the American pushback to the 2nd line. Webster's men now launched their attack against the right flank, where they fought the Virginia and Delaware regiments. Fighting was intense in the close quarters, with bayonets being used and muskets firing at close range. Reports came into Greene that the cannon were taken by the British, and the British soldiers were now moving to the rear of the Americans to encircle them. So Greene gave the order to retreat.
Sir, my letter to Congress, a copy of which I enclose, Your Excellency, will inform you of an unsuccessful action with Lord Cornwallis on the 15th. Our prospects were flattering, and the success of the day seemed to be doubtful for a long time.
Letter Nathaniel Greene to George Washington, 18 March, 1781. It was nearly morning when Greene and the remains of his army reached their camp at the ironworks. The official report of losses for the Americans totals 250 dead, wounded, and captured. Cornwallis, on the other hand, reported 506 dead and wounded. That equates to nearly 27% of his fighting force. Technically, Cornwallis had won the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, but his victory brought about his eventual demise. When Cornwallis reported this victory to Parliament, the celebration was non-existent. Charles Fox summed up the opinion of the battle when he said, "Another such victory would be the ruin of the British army." Cornwallis was forced to return to Wilmington to resupply his troops, and then was ordered by General Clinton to head into Virginia near the area of Yorktown. It was here on October 19, 1781, that Cornwallis surrendered his army to General Washington. Without the exceptional loss of troops at Guilford Courthouse, Cornwallis would have continued to stay in the Carolinas and possibly even slowly eliminated the rebel troops which were prevalent in the Piedmont and mountain areas.